Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm your host, John, and today we're going to be taking a look at a pretty good topic, and it's an hour long, so let's get right to it. What is your workplace horror story? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy. I wasn't there that day when it happened, but heard some of the details. I may be off, but here goes. Two maintenance guys were up in a scissor lift working on an overhead indoor crane. Someone on the floor grabbed the remote for the other crane and started to move it. One maintenance guy yelled "duck" and ducked. The other turned to see what was happening and apparently was crushed between the two cranes and then fell out of the lift. I don't know how true this is, but apparently his insides were out and still alive for a short time. I got a call from my idiot team lead telling me work was shut down for at least the day, probably longer. He didn't mention the guy dying, just mentioned it was awesome to have a long weekend. I was the boss, and some guy wasn't paying attention and had his arm on the bar behind him on the forklift he was backing up. He backed up right into a container and all but severed his arm. Just a small flap of skin was holding it on. He ran in the building, spurting blood all over, and I ran over and stopped him, sat him down, and got one of the guys to get me some stuff for an improvised tourniquet. I held his severed arm under mine, and I squeezed the upper arm to slow the flow until I could get the tourniquet on and tight. All the while I was getting covered in his blood from head to toe. I finally got it stopped and sat there trying to keep him calm while the paramedics were on the way. After they took over, I asked the firemen that accompanied them if they could blast me off with a fire hose. They blasted all the blood off, but my clothes were ruined. I sat outside until I dried and then went home and showered well and threw the stained clothes away. I got dressed and went back to work to help the crew clean up the blood and tossed the chair he was in the trash. I could taste his blood the rest of the day. It even got up my nose. I didn't notice until I went home again, but my mustache and goatee were stained from the blood too. I had to shave clean. They were able to reattach his arm, but it never worked right again. He went on permanent disability afterwards. Was working a graveyard shift at a Comcast, may have been AT&T at the time, call center. There were TVs everywhere with movies on, as there weren't many calls at midnight. Suddenly, all of the TVs shift to a channel change, down to one of the paid porn channels. My coworkers and I spot this and start chanting, "Click it, click it." The click goes through. Then the "Do you accept the charges?" comes up. We chant again and wonder of wonders, it goes through. Suddenly, there's a full spread on every television in the call center. We spot two managers running full tilt across the cubicles, and shortly after, it got shut off. Apparently, the security guard thought the TV at his station was just for him. I work in a manufacturing facility as a buyer. I was in my office one day when I saw two of the product line supervisors sprint by and head toward the production floor. Seems a mechanic had tried to get a machine unjammed and had failed to turn the machine off. He reached in, and the machine indexed and caught his arm. Then it indexed again and partially ripped it off. I was on the safety committee and trained in first aid, so I was called on to assist the plant nurse and safety director. I thought I was going to pass out. The guy was lying on his back, and what was left of his arm was shards of bone and tissue. I'll never forget it. This was years ago. I worked at a small college. One day a woman in financial aid's estranged boyfriend came in and stabbed her to death in front of her coworkers and several students. Campus police were able to arrest him, but didn't get there in time to help her. We also had a healthy 40-year-old professor drop dead of a heart attack while in a meeting with a student. Not as bad as the first one, but it shook the student up pretty badly. We had someone electrocute themselves during their shift. Poor guy was only 18. Went to plug in a floor buffer to an extension cord on the wall. The cord was faulty, but due to reasons was never replaced. When he plugged the buffer in, the shock dropped him, and away he passed. Due to insurance and potential lawsuits from the family over the faulty equipment, the security footage of that night is sealed, and the company went crazy afterwards, removing every single extension cord they used. Long story. I worked in a nursing home kitchen for a month back in 2017. Thankfully, it was a temporary job as I was on summer break from university. There were so many things that were up with that place, and I kept on questioning my boss, the head cook, and the care home manager about many things. Firstly, Raw meat was stored on the top shelf in the fridge, so unhygienic. Not to mention that some of the kitchen staff had very poor personal hygiene too. I once saw one of my colleagues drop a boiled egg on the floor. To my horror, he put it straight back on the plate and gave it to a resident. That's before we even get to some of the carers. I knocked on the residents' doors when I entered a resident's room. One of the senior carers pulled me up about that, but I told him to do one. Thankfully, the head cook had my back about that. Once I noticed that one of the stair banisters was loose in the dementia unit, which many residents used, and mentioned it to the maintenance guys. When they didn't do anything, I went straight to the care home manager to demand that it got done. She managed to turn the subject around from a health and safety issue to me losing my job if I didn't shut up and toe the line. I was just speechless. Oh, and the activities coordinator was one of the most horrible people I'd ever met. She was in charge when the manager wasn't around, but she was even worse than the manager. She acted so nice to the residents and their families, but she treated all the carers and kitchen staff like dog shit and used to go on frequent power trips. I remember on one evening shift, one of the nurses was unhappy because she thought I had served dessert portions too small. No issue, I offered to fix it. The nurse wasn't having that and got the activities coordinator, and 5 minutes later, she gave me an absolute dressing down in front of all of my colleagues. I must admit, I nearly walked out, but I didn't want to screw the guys in the kitchen over either, as they were already short-staffed as it was. It was at that point that I decided, I'm never coming back to this place once this shift is over. The head cook texted me that evening after I'd finished work, and basically told me that whilst he liked me, I was not welcome back at all. Apparently I'd pissed off the higher-ups for talking back and being disrespectful. I had a feeling it was coming anyway though, and went back to university to complete my degree. Every time I have a bad day at my current job, I always think, at least I'm not at the nursing home. Thankfully, one of the kitchen staff, who I had always got on with, quit his job not long after that, and reported the nursing home to the council as an anonymous whistleblower. The council sent an inspector to the home, and they noticed everything that was wrong. Apparently the care home manager got a massive fine, yet somehow still kept her job. To my amusement though, she complains in the town's Facebook group about being short-staffed. I have to say that's pretty impressive that you even lasted a month in that environment. Seems pretty horrible. Glad you made it out, and not surprised they're short-staffed. Formerly worked at a residential group home, my wife and I. Context: while we were employees, my wife was pregnant and kicked in the lower abdomen by a client, suffered a miscarriage. The director and myself had a disagreement. He was a narcissist. We told him that we would like to adopt a client, 5-year-old, out of the group home. He did not like that because when the clients are adopted or moved, the facility loses funding. He resorted to yelling at me and looked my wife square in the eyes and said, "How about next time you get pregnant, don't let it die, Think you could do that? If so, we won't have to have conversations like this." First time I ever spent the night in jail, and the first time he ever had a broken nose and eye socket. Worth it. Dude got fired for being useless and a huge creep towards anyone he was even remotely attracted to. He'd always been quite inappropriate with his jokes and about what kind of stuff you're supposed to talk about in the workplace. Hint, not your puppy play fetish or Nazi sympathies. But it had gotten out of control by that point. During his 1-month period of notice, he wore the same clothes every day and never showered. On his very last day, he went into one of the bathrooms, jacked off, and came over everything. Don't work there anymore. This was an internship I had in construction management, asphalt paving contractor. Several years ago, an inspector, who was hard of hearing, was out on the job site. He did not realize he was in the way of an asphalt compactor. The compactors move really slowly, and their brakes are not built to abruptly stop, at least the old ones, seeing as you could see these things coming with more than enough time to move. Several guys on the equipment tried yelling at him to get out of the way, thinking he would right away, but he didn't hear them. The guy on the compactor obviously applied the brakes, but the others realized too late that he wasn't getting out of the way. You could imagine what happened next. They said the sounds were unimaginable. He didn't make a noise, but his body being crushed did. They had to scrape him off the pavement. The guy on the compactor took an office job after this and now has severe PTSD. Not workplace thing, but my senior year of high school. I'm a shy, introverted, quiet loner who wears dark colors like dark black, blue, red, but nothing inappropriate. Someone decided it would be funny to start a rumor that I was going to become a school shooter and shoot up the place. I was pulled out of class, put into therapy, and grilled on my feelings. If I had plans to kill myself or anyone else, did I have a grudge against anyone? I lost all my friends. I had 4 friends, due to them being scared and not wanting to be associated with me. I could feel all the teachers watching my every move. I did get lucky by the fact that they decided not to search my person or binder every day. I became depressed and angry for the rest of senior year though. I work in a restaurant. One evening, one of the salad tenders cut off the tip of his finger, and it was bad enough that he had to go to the hospital for it. Unfortunately, the salad he was making somehow made it out of the kitchen and onto a table. Shortly after, a guest complained about something chewy in their salad that they thought was a piece of bacon, and they didn't want bacon in their salad. The salad guy couldn't find the tip of his finger before he left. Ugh. Well, sometimes you ask for a little extra protein in your salad and you get it. On the upside, you're officially a cannibal. A long-term employee who started at a lowest rung was promoted repeatedly over time to his level of incompetence as a manager. It was only because the CEO was close personal friends with him, not because the guy was in any way qualified for the job. Turns out this guy's main objective was to make everyone's lives as miserable as possible, to subject employees to the vagaries of his temperamental whims, and make workers feel afraid of his potential reprimands for the least little thing. It turned what once was a pleasant, productive environment into an oppressive, fear-dominated workplace. A man was murdered in aisle 8 in the freezer section of the grocery store I worked at. Happened 2 minutes after I left my shift for the day. One guy made an inappropriate comment about the other guy's 14-year-old daughter, and he didn't like that. He stewed for a bit, took his groceries and family out of his car, went back inside, confronted the man, and turned physical. Guy knocked him to the ground and stomped his head into the ground. Afterwards, he was outside after someone called the police, went outside and said goodbye to his family, that he was going away for a long time, and waited for the police to arrive. I worked for a large mutual fund company. A woman from a different department was quite distraught when she was fired. Later, she called her sister, who lived in a different state, and told her that she dreamed that she killed their mom. When the sister couldn't get a hold of their mom and learned that she hadn't shown up for work, she called the local police and asked them to do a welfare check. They found a makeshift altar in the basement with teddy bears and lit candles, and the mother encased in 70 pounds of salt. The search was then on for the other daughter. She was found dead in her car, apparently from suicide. For a while after that, when my coworkers and I would annoy each other, we would say stuff like, "I heard Walgreens is having a sale on salt, 70 pounds for $5. I know this already sounds like bullshit, but it gets weirder. Apparently her father was in prison for killing his second wife's mother and, you guessed it, encasing her in salt. Was working as a CNA, certified nursing assistant in a nursing home. Had a patient who had just gotten back from the hospital. Hospital sent patients back with the catheter, but since patient had not been using a catheter before when they were there, the nurses go and remove the catheter, and we were to monitor to make sure the patient urinated. Later in the day, I worked 3 to 11 p.m. then. Patient asks for help to go to the bathroom, which is great. I get patient onto the toilet and step out. They were with it and everything, so he put the call light on when he was done. Call light goes on, so I go in there to help him out. I help him stand up, and that's when I notice the toilet is full of blood, and the man is bleeding like crazy out of his third arm, as I will call it. I sit the man down quickly, pop out to tell the nurse who comes in, sees the carnage, and immediately runs back to go call 911. While the nurse does her thing, I stay with the man until paramedics show up. The man is bleeding so much, however, that before the paramedics arrive, the dude passes out from blood loss, and I ended up being forced to lower him down onto the floor as I cannot keep his limp body sitting up on the toilet. By the time the paramedics get there, which really isn't that long as they had good response times, I am just sitting there with this guy on the floor, with which blood is just everywhere on the floor at this point. I was a CNA for 6 years and saw a lot of shit, including people dying, but that incident has stuck with me more than anything. I worked at a supermarket for 6 years, and I saw a few interesting things. This time, when I was working nights for a couple of months, I got to know the night team well. generally sound guys, but there were a few I'd keep my distance from. It became apparent to me one morning when I was washing my hands and see something in the corner of my eye, a work shoe which contained a human shit. After reporting this, there being some investigation into the phantom shitter, it happened again. This time a colleague of mine discovered it, having unfortunately put his shoe on before realizing the shit. On other occasions, a colleague had finished using the toilet and then realized that there was a shit strategically balanced on the hook on the cubicle door. Upon this being reported, it was realized that this person could be caught. CCTV, once the security guard managed to narrow footage down, questioning began. However, nothing came from it and no one got caught. I know that when I left the job 10 months ago, the culprit had neither owned up nor been caught. Word got out about 3 people that it could have been, but it just stopped being talked about and everyone moved on. Whether or not this person left, we will never know. All we know is that a man liked to shit in people's shoes and balance them on things. I'm gonna do it. Okay. This work environment seemed like a real shitty place to be. One of my long-term employees was often late, claiming his neighbors had kept him up all night, or he was unwell with migraines, etc. My wife suffers with migraines, and we had shitty neighbors too, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. One day he didn't show up, and I couldn't get a hold of him. After a couple of hours, the police show up to tell me his place was raided at dawn, and they've arrested him for downloading and distributing child porn. Turns out, he was spending all night doing their nasty shit, and then showing up for work knackered, and I accepted his apologies and excuses for years because he was good at his job. Okay. I had this guy who was around 650 pounds come into the hospital via EHS. It took 12 people to move him onto a stretcher. He was coated in rotting flesh from his behind, groin, and thighs from sitting in a recliner for so long, and there were flies buzzing everywhere. There were so many maggots and flies covering him that we had to shower him outside of the department while he lay in the stretcher. We wheeled him into the trauma bay, leaving a trail of brown rot water behind him. Lucky me, I got assigned the job of placing a Foley catheter in him. I had 2 masks, a gown, and as much other PPE as I could find. The smell was not masked in the slightest. As I tried to fight back my dry heaving, I pulled the blanket back that was covering him in an attempt to grab his penis for cleaning prior to catheter insertion. There were still maggots literally all over his groin and legs, and some were legitimately falling out of his penis hole. I damn near threw up in my mask. I remember thinking to myself, oh my god, I'm going to be pushing maggots up into this bladder, but I gotta do what I gotta do. End result for all, if you're wondering, he passed away later that evening. My uncle had a printing firm and used to have this machine that loaded massive sheets of paper by spinning 2 pin-covered rollers. One day, hears screaming, and the new guy is shoulder deep in the machine. Call the fire brigade and ambulance service, and they have to dismantle the machine to get him out. His arm is all ripped up and blood is just everywhere. Then someone notices that the bloke is missing a finger. Frantic search for the missing digit starts, then the bloke says, "Don't worry about the finger. That's what happened the last time I used one of those." Gonna keep names and places out of this because I still have an active NDA. Anyways, at the beginning of every summer, we would have a big influx of new hires as students were getting out of school and people were generally just looking for work. Anyways, one of our new hires was the burly guy that looks like he was in his 30s or 40s. Dude had a sleeve of tattoos and wore a Confederate flag bandana. Anyways, he comes in on his first day, almost immediately gets on our supervisor for not doing anything. I don't know if this dude was aware that he was chirping at a supervisor. Supervisor ignores this for like 10 minutes before finally saying, "This is your first day. Do you really want to get a bad rep with your supervisor?" This dude keeps spouting off at the soup, all while the soup is telling him to just go home and he can try to come back tomorrow with a better attitude. Eventually, the dude gets all up in the soup's face and pushes him. Soup had enough of this at this point and goes to slug the dude. Dude whips a gun out of his back of his pants and blasts the soup right in the stomach. Everyone flips out and starts running at this point. I immediately left through a window, so I don't know what happened next, but from what I heard, the dude with the gun just kinda stood there in shock, like he didn't know what just happened. Cops came and surrounded the building and dragged the dude out. Supervisor survived, but had to relearn how to walk. I was cutting a guy's hair, and a guy's high off tits or drunk or both came to the door. I finished my client, and we were just laughing, literally just laughing. Next thing I know, the drunk guy said, "Are you laughing at me?" The customer said, "No, we're just laughing." After a bit of back and forth, they started fighting right in the shop. Another customer and my colleague managed to split them up whilst I stayed in the corner due to having nowhere else to go. He started saying random shit whilst being ushered out. Then he swung round with a taser, an effing taser. I managed to sneak out and call the police, but by the time the police got there, he was long gone. Luckily, no one got seriously injured. A few weeks later, turns out he was found causing trouble somewhere else, got arrested, tagged, and community service whilst on parole. Many years ago, I was a teacher at a very fancy, rich high school, the kind of place where politicians sent their kids. Most of the students were either taken to and from school by chauffeurs or boarded. During a sports event, one kid suddenly had a seizure. He wasn't confused or anything, he'd just been sitting and watching at the time. There was a flurry of teachers variously keeping other children back, moving chairs out of the way so he didn't hit his head, calling an ambulance, first aid, all of that. Of course, once the immediate danger had passed and he was in the recovery position, his parents were called. Due to the emergency, their family staff let the call go through to the father directly. "Mr. Parent, this is son's teacher at school. Your son is okay now, but he's just had a seizure. An ambulance is..." "Father, no he didn't. Sorry? I don't think I was clear. Your son had a seizure. He's recovered..." "Father, no, my son has never had a seizure. Good day." And he hung up. Talking to the poor boy later revealed that this had happened before. He was told it was dehydration or other such things. People don't usually remember much during seizures, so that helped convince him that it was minor, I suppose. He was unaware of the twitching, vomiting, lack of consciousness. He just remembered being with his friends one moment, then suddenly waking up with a huge headache. Among the rich and wanna-be rich, parents will sometimes doctor shop to get their children diagnosed with whatever as an attention-seeking, "aren't we unique" sort of thing. But among the very rich and influential, it's kind of the reverse. They have incredible power and freedom, but only if they fit into a certain image. Epilepsy is a health condition that is unacceptable. His father basically had decided that his son did not have any such disorder, and being rich and powerful, it's easy to convince others. I still feel absolutely awful for that poor boy. My one day working at FedEx, the interview and training process was unremarkable, mostly focused on the evils of unions, normal propagandist crap. During the training, we had to watch a video on safety regulations we were expected to behave by. After 2 hours of videos, they took me out on the floor for my first day unloading the trucks. One of those safety regulations is that every truck was supposed to have 3 people to it. 2 people would unload, while the third was tasked with checking and marking packages for sorting. 10 minutes in, and my second unloader disappears. A supervisor comes and takes the sorter away, telling me that they'll sort my truck farther down the belt. I'm left to unload the entirety of an 18-wheeler myself. I get an hour in with a few problems by moving the lightest packages and praying that someone is going to come help me soon. 2 hours in, I'm deadlifting 75 to 100-pound packages out of this truck by myself. Last hour of the shift, my supervisor reappears because the truck wasn't being unloaded. I was pinned under 200 pounds of furniture. 2 other unloaders were called to free me, and I was reprimanded for not having a second lifter with me. 2 weeks of rest, a short investigation, and a workman comp filing later, the supervisor was forced to acknowledge they were responsible for removing the 2 other workers from my truck. I asked when they could expect me back to work, and I told them to shove it. I still have back issues years later, and there's a spot about the diameter of a soda can where my back still feels like pins and needles. I worked at an AFC home with some incompetent people. One in particular couldn't drive, couldn't cook, and have over 9 medication errors in 6 months. But the most that would happen was she got written up. It was a reoccurring thing that the people like her didn't get fired. Rights would be called, but that somehow never led to her getting investigated or suspended. When I say medication errors, I mean she passed the wrong medication to residents. One resident even stopped her and asked her if he was getting new medications, and she just responded, "I don't know, just take your medication." It was someone else's meds she ended up passing to the resident. Mind you, we have names on everything, and everything is logged in the computer, You check off as you go, so there is no excuses for passing the wrong medications. I work at a local nursing home. It's a simple culinary job where I work on one of 3 floors in a healthcare building. The first floor is assisted living, the second is rehab, and the third is for those who are no longer fully mentally there. And oh boy, sexual harassment comes from all angles here. We work closely with nursing, and one of the male nurses likes to make very uncomfortable, sexually toned advances on me and one of the other girls I work with. He's asked her a ton of super personal questions, commented on our bodies, touched us without our permission, etc. Reported him, but we're understaffed, so he just works on another floor and still roams around to find us. 2 of the residents also do some very inappropriate things, and it's hard to work here knowing I'm probably going to get followed around for 12 hours and told this older man needs my rack. The other one did something to one of the ladies on the 3rd and is now permanently moved to the floor I work on. I don't blame the elderly quite as much, but the man is it draining. Unfortunately, I need this job to pay off student loans. I don't know if we'll ever solve sexual harassment because people are people, and I'm not excusing it or making an excuse for it, but I mean, it's been in almost every workplace I've ever been in, so I don't know. What do you think? When I worked at an industrial and medical gas plant in London, there was a driver who always had his phone in his face texting. This is before smartphones in the 90s. One day, he went out of the plant, loaded up to do his rounds. A few hours later, word got around this guy had been in an accident. Turns out a young man was taking his mother to dinner for her birthday, stopped on the hard shoulder, and was standing outside his car talking to his mom through her passenger side window. Our driver, fully loaded with flammables, etc., apparently was texting on his phone whilst driving at speed. His truck left his lane, went into the hard shoulder, and hit this guy's car from behind. At that exact moment, the guy had his head inside the passenger window talking to his mother. The collision decapitated him, and his head literally landed in his mother's lap. He got several years imprisonment for it. This is from my old job. It was a charity shop, so we relied on a lot of donations to resell. Now, there is a list of things we don't take as standard, and some we will refuse for it being too big or because in the past they don't sell. And one day this woman comes in with a glass TV stand, and we say we won't take it because they don't sell any reasonable. A person would have accepted that. But this woman chose to throw the stand down, causing it to shatter, leaving broken glass on the floor, and in the frame, she walked out, leaving me and another employee to clean up the mess, which involved breaking the rest of the glass to not cut our hands, sweeping it up, and disassembling the frame. The kicker is afterwards, as I'm taking out the pieces, she's around the back of the shop and has a go at me for throwing away her donation, which she had just broken in our shop. I used to work for a place assisting people with traumatic brain injuries. The idea was we were there to help them be as independent as possible. One day I get this call that one of our clients needs help at a doctor's office. I went there, and he had fallen while defecating and literally could not clean and clothe himself. I helped him get up and get clean. When we get back and I debriefed with my boss, I was chastised for helping instead of directing the guy to do things himself. He had physical impairments. I work in a large warehouse that uses forklifts. On the night shift, one guy was driving his forklift and he had a patch of water. A cleaner were notorious for being lazy and leaving puddles everywhere. His forklift slid directly into a pole, and he had to instinctively put his leg out to stop the impending crash. It didn't work. His leg was crushed, and he was bleeding profusely. It was 7 minutes of him screaming in agony and dragging himself through the warehouse looking for help. Ambulance was eventually called, and he had to have his leg amputated just above the knee. The worst part? He was not compensated for it, as he was fired for driving through a spill and leaving the scene of an accident. I still remember walking into work the next day and seeing so much blood all over. Back in the 70s, I used to work on an oil drilling rig. Rigs run around the clock in 3 to 8 hour shifts. Myself along with my crew arrived at the rig to find that the rig wasn't drilling. The rig was in standby mode. Drill pipe was rotating and the drill bit just suspended off the bottom of the hole, and the crew that were going to relieve were not there. The only person there was the rig's tool pusher, which is a fancy title for the boss. The boss came into the driller shack and told us what had happened during the previous shift, It's wintertime, and everyone has to dress warm. You work on a drilling rig, you're going to fight the elements. But what had happened was, one of the workers crawled down inside the drawworks, which is basically the power lift equipment that controls the power drum. The cable winds up on that lift that drills the pipe in and out of the hole. Down in the drawworks, where the crew member entered, there's a high-speed jack shaft that couples the diesel engines to the transmission to the drawback. This jack shaft has a coupler and that allows the shaft to be taken apart if need be. The jack shaft spins at around 1500 RPM at ideal speed. The worker that was down in the tight area had backed into this jack shaft while he was greasing other components in that area. The coupler he backed into had a grease zerk that caught his clothing, coat, and just started winding him up into the shaft. It spun him up and pulled him through a 2x2 foot hole and threw him up against the drawwork motors. He hit hard enough that it broke the fuel filters and lines off of one of the motors. An ambulance had come and got him and took him to hospital. He was lucky. The top of the grease zerk, after catching his clothes, had left a red scrap just up his spine, just barely scratching his skin. He was banged up really bad from being dragged through the hole he didn't really fit through, then from being slammed against the engine. He came away with a broken collarbone, cuts and bruises, and 5 broken ribs. A very fortunate person to have survived. 2 things I took away from this story. 1, I don't think I understood about half the words in it because I just don't know about all the drills and the diesel stuff and all that. And 2, that guy was beyond lucky. I'm reading this thinking like, well, he's smushed into a little box. But he lived. Cool. As a funeral industry worker, I can't really go into any details at all, but I will say this. If someone dies who is of an extreme bariatric size, it is not reasonable for them to be presented 2 weeks after death, especially if the coroner was involved. The rate of decay is usually accelerated with a larger body with increased fat tissue. And if the discoloration doesn't do it for you, the smell often will. Fun bonus advice. Always measure the external coffin width before speaking to gravediggers or crematorium. Most older crematoria have a size limit of around 30 to 34 inches and will send the coffin back to the funeral home if it won't fit. This is always why it's wise to always keep notes of the extra large sized crematoriums and keep their staff members sweet. Working as a bouncer in the UK on my own on a Tuesday evening at a pub in Poole Quay. Stood on the front door, took a swig of coffee, and looked inside. There was a guy on his back on a table with another guy over him, so I ran in to break up the situation. As I got closer, it looked like the guy on top is kissing the other guy. Nope, he was biting a chunk out of his lip. Had to radio for town camera team to call police whilst I kicked the guy out, then patched up the profusely bleeding guy. Pro first aid tip, use cling film for heavily bleeding wounds as it won't stick and cause further damage when you take the dressing off. The victim was pretty calm. His female friend was a hysterical mess. A year later, I saw the hungry guy again, and he recognized me. Amazingly, he thanked me for getting him arrested and said that he was out of control at the time, and after going to prison, he'd sorted his life out and was back on track to being normal, non-cannibalistic human again. Worked in a large hospital back in the olden days of paper charts, mid-90s. The records department was quite large, and there were shelves and shelves of them, like a huge library. Records were on the first floor, and there were outpatient clinics on the second floor. The hospital was multiple stories, maybe 10. This will be important later. Some jackass kid was in the waiting room on the second floor while the parent had an appointment, and they thought it would be funny to go into the bathroom and light some M80s and flush them down the toilet. Now, one M80 might have just stressed the pipe, but 3 of them was equivalent to almost half a stick of dynamite. The fireworks had hit the main stack before they blew, so 9 floors worth of feces, urine, and liquid biological waste was let loose in the ceiling above. You guessed it, the medical records department. The explosion triggered the fire alarms and some other kind of facilities alarms, so we all ran out to the lobby. We could see through the wall-to-wall glass interior windows. There was a literal poo soaking the drop ceiling, raining down onto the racks of records, soaking them, and the smell was god-awful. The best part, our department head ordered us back in with rolls of plastic sheeting and told us to protect the records. We all looked at her like she was a crackhead. Eventually, some of the employees did go back in to help, but most of us noped out. A few days later, our entire department was ordered to get Hep A shots and issued N95 masks. Our office wasn't habitable for almost 2 weeks, and when we went back, we were told to clean our desktop surfaces and chairs ourselves with spray cleaner, and they had not yet shampooed our office carpets. About 2/3 of the staff quit on the spot. Most of the staff were older and riding out this job until retirement, and they just pieced out and put in their retirement papers early. I felt bad for the patients though. For some of them, that was a lifetime of their medical history destroyed. The hospital hired some biohazard remediation company to come in and photocopy whatever they could salvage, but most of the records were a total loss. In anticipation of your questions, I'm no OSHA expert or plumber, but yes, I know they rinsed blood and pus down the drain for the surgical theaters. No, I don't know what happened to the kid, like if the hospital sued his parents or anything. Yes, I was one of the people who quit on the spot. We were planning to move in a few months to a different state, so I didn't really care about the job. Also, this was before HIPAA was a thing, so the secrecy of the records was not as intense. I was a freshman in college working for my school's facility department as a secretary. At the start, everyone was praising Mr. for how well I was doing and how much I was taking on. I had 2 superiors and 1 boss. One superior was threatened by me. She was older and didn't know much about technology, and there I was doing things she couldn't or wouldn't. She started to give me tasks I would never be able to complete, things that I found on my last day when I quit I should have never even worked on. She told lies about me to people, shamed me in front of others, and was just plain nasty to me, yelled at me for asking the head of maintenance a question. I was asked the day I quit why I am quitting. I told it all. She ended up being fired, as this wasn't her first time doing this to a student. Plus, she gave me documents I wasn't allowed to legally see. So, yeah. Worked at a stem cell place. The HR manager shoved me in a closet and hit me and started interrogating me about what I had told her cousin, my boss, one of the doctors. I had quit and told him that part of the reason I was leaving was because of her. This job was not the right fit for me. She wasn't training me. She had opened up her purse once before and told me she had a pill popping problem as I looked at multiple different pills in her purse. She had also messed up all the patients I had scheduled on wrong days to try to get me fired. I started yelling for her to unlock the door. She unlocks the closet door. I called the cops. You know cops, they're such great help. I told them what happened as I'm crying. They can't find her for an hour. Then they do. They come back to me and say, "Sorry, there's nothing we can do. Your stories don't match." Even though I have the bruises and she hid for an hour, what the F would I make this shit up after the fact that I put in my 2 weeks? I was extremely underqualified for the place I worked at prior to my current position. They hired me despite knowing this. On top of that, they never properly trained me. The only training they provided was basically the equivalent of coursework from college that had absolutely nothing to do with the work I did afterwards. At some point, being new and untrained, I effed something up. It wasn't a huge unfixable mistake. Instead of telling me what I did wrong and how I could fix it or improve, he yelled at me for 5 minutes, picking apart my work, asking me how I could possibly think that certain numbers went into certain places. Afterwards, he yelled at me to go fix it without actually telling me how to fix it. The next day, he kicked me off the team and sent me to work with a different manager. That guy had been promoted to manager shortly after I started working there, so I thought it was just him being new to management and not really handling it in the best way. A few months later, we were forced to work from home. I'm not sure what flipped in the mind of this other manager, but he became just as bad if not worse than my previous manager. I'd get up and log into work every day just to spend the day being berated over Teams by this guy. He'd do the same thing, vaguely explain what needs to be done without an actual guidance, then get upset when I didn't know what I was doing. At some point, he started berating me just for the sake of it. He'd ignore things I'd say to him, then yell at me later on, acting as if I hadn't given him info that he requested, which was probably false, as there was written records over Teams. He even berated me for working with a coworker who was working on the same effing project. My days became a cycle of logging in, being berated for not knowing things, then being accused of intentionally ignoring my manager, when I'd use the washroom and log out feeling like absolute shit. By the end of it, I hated logging in so much that I'd log in, then go back to bed for a couple of hours. I decided that for my mental health, I had to quit because I started lashing out at my friends. I still get anxious whenever I hear Teams notification. At my last coffee shop job, we were told to take out all of the trash cans, one in the lobby, one behind the counter, one by the coffee grinder, and one for each of the bathrooms, in a specific order. One night, I started to take out the bathroom trash cans, which I did first, but before I could replace them with new bags, I got a mini rush that lasted about 10 to 15 minutes. When I finished with them and went back to the bathrooms, I found out that someone had snuck in through our back customer door and threw their used underwear that they'd crapped inside of in one of the trash cans. I never saw this person and had no idea who it was. Even though my manager reviewed the CCTV, I trusted her way more to handle it than our bosses, so I'm going to assume they did nothing to actually help. The smell was nothing else like I'd ever encountered in my life, and when the person threw them in, they smeared the side of the can. Ugh. My bosses didn't have any PPE, this was before COVID, that I could use to safely dispose of the situation, so I had to go to the restaurant next door to ask them for gloves and something to cover my face. I'm so grateful the shop was empty because my immediate reaction was to run to the lobby trash can and puke in it, one of many reasons why there's a former job of mine. And once again, another example of a shitty work environment and experience and bathroom. Not entirely sure if this counts, but it happened at work. So I go into work one morning, and at the time my car was a doorstop, so I had to take a taxi. This was actually the first week with my new expanded hours for me, so I was showing up a bit earlier than I normally would. My coworker and I exchanged greetings. We're actually pretty chill. It was actually a pretty decent place to work, and one of the other workers went out for a smoke break. They came in with a chunk of palm that had some burn marks on it. They said it had fallen from the sky, which I thought was kind of weird. So I walked outside and noticed in the air a chunk of birch bark kind of floating from the sky in ashes. If you don't know how much about birch, it's quite well known in survival circles due to being able to hold a flame like a candle due to how much resin kind of pumps just beneath the bark's surface. I knew at that time we were in trouble. Fortunately, I had a coworker show up who was able to take me home and grab a very few things, but at least a few things we could, as well as my roommates, who didn't want to leave because he felt he didn't have anything else. Roommates would later screw me over, but that's another tale. We were just leaving just as the wildfire started to destroy the town. The color of the sky changed from gray ash to a kind of haunting, hellish orange. The last picture I have of that town before it was destroyed in wildfire is of the chunk of palm burned and charred on a table at work. Might not be traditionally horrific, but from the perspective of really bad anxiety, it is enough to make me never confront anyone at work ever again. We hired a guy my age with no experience in the same role as me, but I found out he's making $15 an hour while I have been there for a year making $13. After over a week of building myself up and getting ready to go talk to my boss, I finally do it. I walk into that office, start the conversation, and then he looks at me like I'm crazy. Apparently, it is sacrilegious in that office to know other people's wages, and I immediately get shot down. My entire section is called into his tiny office, and we talk about how I am not allowed to talk to people about wages. Now, my manager and coworker in that section hate my guts, and I have to ride it out until I can quit. Bonus points, it's a federal crime to have a policy against employees discussing wages. There was this one guy that got hired at my workplace. He was a pretty big fella, and kinda unintentionally creepy, I think. Anyway, the place where I worked had more females than males at work there, who he quickly tried to make friends with. Unfortunately, his way of making friends was to creep up behind you and whisper shout weird shit like, "I want to steal your soul," while you were sweeping the floor or manning the cash register. He once came up to me and told me he kept a knife in his car and the blade was super long while using his fingers to indicate size. That wasn't exactly something I found comforting, nor was it something I wanted to know. It didn't take long for the other girls that worked with me to grow uncomfortable working the same shift as him, to the point where one girl was crying because he creeped her out so much. Since no one wanted to work with him, especially at night, I organized all the girls who had a problem with him into a group and then had us all approach another male manager who didn't manage our department. But if we went to him with a problem, he was obligated to take action whether he supervised us or not. He did his job and included our manager because he had to when one of her employees was a problem, and a couple of days later, the guy quit because the managers wouldn't stop monitoring him. My manager was upset with me though because I had the girls make the report to the other manager. The thing was, the other manager was a big guy too, and was known to be intimidating on the best of days. Our manager was a below average height woman who was at best annoying but otherwise not exactly intimidating. I thought it was obvious why I would have thought it best to ask the more physically imposing person to tell a physically imposing person to stop his unwanted behavior, but I guess not. Was a first-year teacher at a middle school with a principal who was completely complacent in giving new staff the support they needed. I had been sexually and physically assaulted by the students more than once. It felt there was nothing I could do because during your first year you're on a probationary contract. One day a kid assaults me again, and once again I call the office for help and no one comes. I email my principal outlining the incident, explaining her negligence and telling her that I will be taking the next few days off of work to treat my mental health. Well, she didn't like that, so she had the school resource officer, Baker, act me instead. Led me out of the school in handcuffs. When I got to the psych ward, they told me everything my principal had said, a bunch of lies. I explained what really happened, showed them some proof, and they let me out as soon as the doctor okayed it. Normally, they'd hold you for 72 hours. I was out in like 10. Left the psych ward to find my principal had been blowing up my phone, asking when I'd be back at work. When I finally did go back, I discovered she had told the entire staff that Miss Polar Bear Pants had a crazy mental breakdown and had to be sent to an institution. Yeah, I quit. Worked in a restaurant as a 16 to 17-year-old. This guy was harassing me to go out with him. He was 26, nice, calling me pretty, doing my work for me, being nicer to me than the others, doing the creepy things where he needed to move past, he'd grab my waist, and even if I wanted to, I wasn't really allowed to date at the time anyways. I told management, and they had just said that's how he is with everyone, and he was. So I told him I was a lesbian. He starts going around telling employees he can turn me back, all while completely ignoring me. Eventually, I did meet a guy I liked, and he worked the same strip, so he would visit me at work. Obviously, 26 male, put two and two together, and started basically always loudly talking shit about me. One time, he even threatened me to a coworker. Nobody ever defended me until the female manager told me he called me a bitch, and so she was writing him up, and instead, he got a promotion. I quit. I loved that job, and when I quit, I cried. I'm a teacher. I don't know if there was a stomach bug or if something in the school canteen had gone off, but about halfway through my lesson a few years back, one of my students threw up all over his desk. Okay, that happens sometimes. I get the cleaning supplies and send him to sickbay. As I'm cleaning, another kid throws up. Good thing I've already got the cleaning stuff here. I send her back to sickbay and continue cleaning. Then 2 more kids. At this point, I called the office and told them that I think my class is ill and that I need someone to help me clean up. One of the janitors showed up and helps me clean, as 2 more kids run to the bathroom next to my class. In total, about 8 students in my class of 25 threw up that period, and 13 were away the next day sick. I worked for one of the I've fallen and can't get up companies in the emergency call center for a few years, and have a bunch of stories that still stick with me now a decade later. A little backstory. When someone presses their button and needs help, the system stays primed until the reset button is pressed to notify us that help has arrived. If it isn't pressed, it automatically calls back into the call center so someone can follow up to make sure they got help. This one day, I got a call from an older woman who's totally fine, but she can't get out of the bathtub by herself. Since she didn't have any family listed in the help section, I had to send out emergency services to assist her. 45 minutes pass. I get the follow-up call because the reset button was never pressed. I come back over the speaker, confirm no one arrived, and that she's a little cold, but otherwise fine. I call EMS back to make sure someone goes out there. Skip ahead another 45 minutes. I get another signal that the unit hasn't been reset. This time, when I come over the speaker, it's an EMT telling me that she had drowned. Their family wasn't on the list to be asked for help, but they were on the list to be notified when something happened. It was protocol that we couldn't tell them that their family member had passed. We just had to tell them that something happened and they should get to the house right away to speak with EMS. I dreaded those calls normally, but I couldn't do it this time and had to have my coworker make it for me. There was no reason for her to have died, but she did because EMS took too long to get to her. I had a co-manager at a gas station who was extra nasty to me just for being cheerful and friendly early in the morning and occasionally mishearing or misunderstanding what I was being asked and asking for clarification. She openly called me blank in front of coworkers, customers, and anybody. Anybody I complained to said that's just how she is and never did anything. I was the only person she ever did that to. She cornered me at one point and told me she could do whatever she wanted, and I couldn't stop her. I had exactly one coworker who was shocked by how she treated me. I also have a 2.0 version of that coworker at my current job. The only difference being she doesn't call me blank to my face. She's mean to everyone, always yelling. I'm autistic and constantly have to tell her I need direct instruction, and she says she shouldn't have to talk to me like a child, which implies that she screams at every adult she encounters. Literally, all I ask for her is not to yell at me, and if I didn't ask for clarification and did the wrong thing anyway, she would still yell at me. Not only is she nasty to me, she's nasty to everyone else too. Nobody likes her. I have a relatively new coworker who is disabled and has issues with a knife because her hands shake from medication. She was hired as a cashier, not to cut things, and our coworker is constantly nasty to her for not being able to cut watermelon for fruit salad. I've offered to do it. Asshole coworker won't show me how. She wants it done. New coworker asked if she should freeze the bread for the weekend. Asshole coworker yelled at her because it was too early. She leaves before close. How would she know? Gets yelled at for asking customers simple questions that are usually given because a customer yelled at her for not asking once, so she started asking everyone, a valid course of action. She's one of those people who thinks you can't be disabled if you don't look it. She'll make allowances for our coworkers with MS that use a wheelchair, but whatever my shaky-handed coworker has, I've never asked, my autism and my cerebral palsy are all excuses. She's leaving soon. Fairly certain the only reason our otherwise very nice boss kept her around so long is because she was the only person who would do that amount of work she does for him for whatever he pays her. No vacation and no benefits. Something I really wish he'd start giving because I really like my job, but will have to leave to find something with insurance next year because I won't be able to be on my parents' insurance anymore. I once worked in housekeeping, and I went to one particular unit. I always used to do the beds first, as I hated making beds. This place was an absolute shithole, rubbish everywhere, toilet destroyed, floor filthy. Anyways, I went and did the beds after an hour and a half there and went to the kids' room. The guests had pushed 2 singles together and put a double sheet on it. Behold, when I pulled them apart, a pile of human shit. I hovered it up because I wasn't dealing with it as I legally didn't have to, as I work in a kitchen. Haha, some poor effer had to clean it. I feel bad, but I don't get paid enough for that. Worked at a coffee house, and a customer's baby went blue while she was ordering. He was choking on a cookie she gave him. The dad started the Heimlich maneuver and CPR while I called 911 and ran to the parking lot to get the EMTs to the coffee place on time because they got lost. It's a big shopping mall, and if no one wanted to go help the EMTs find the place, I'd literally grab them by the hand and drag them to the baby through the F crowd of like 50 people so they can save the baby. My boss drove to the hospital, gave her food for free, and added more sweets for her and gave her a $100 coupon as a gift. He was so nice. He later told me that if I hadn't dragged the EMTs to the baby, he would have passed away from oxygen loss, and they got there seconds away from a horrible outcome. I cried in the back room for 30 minutes, and my boss told us to go home and rest. I, now 35 female, worked for a boutique marketing company. It was about 15 to 25 people from the time I got hired to when I left over 2.5 years. Upon getting hired, I thought I was about to find the right place for me to be. I thought there was a way to move up. In the first 6 months, I started to notice that when someone left for another opportunity, there were some hushed conversations that pained that everyone is a traitor or is a bad employee. Because I didn't know any better, I thought maybe that was true. After a year at the company, I started to see that unless you were someone willing to work insane overtime and never make a mistake ever, you were talked down to. After a year and a half, I woke up every morning crying because I didn't want to go to work. Every day I was afraid that I would be berated for not doing enough. I wasn't capable. I was letting the CEO, a woman, down. It was a cycle of being told you weren't taking enough responsibility, but then if you didn't do it the way they wanted, you were scolded. Next time, before a big decision, you asked and then told you need to be more independent. The cycle was constant. During the pandemic, we went to work from home, and at the time I started to talk with another coworker at another office. Suddenly, we started to align and realize how much gaslighting was going on. Expectations were high, pay was low, management was aggressive and abusive. Our stories were similar, so he spoke to the CEO about us working together. Maybe we could improve our department if we had better communication between offices. The CEO calls me and tells me that he's trying to steal my job. I call him after to tell him. He laughs. We now know she's isolating and playing her employees against each other in order to keep control. Seems like the hero, and enforce the blind loyalty her employees had to her. He puts in his 2 weeks. I start aggressively searching for a job. A week after his last day, I put in my 2 weeks. In the course of about 3 months, 10 people quit. This was not isolated to us. I'm so glad I left. I'm a 12-year-old male, and I live in Canada and live with my mom like a normal 12-year-old boy. It was about 2 years ago, and I was about 10 at the time. My mom was at work and I was home alone. I was chilling in my room when the doorbell rang, so I got up and answered the door. It was my auntie. She was looking for my mom, but I told her she wasn't here. So she went to her vehicle and got her little boy. He was 5 at the time. She asked me if I could watch him. I said yeah, but I then thought and remembered my mom had late work hours, but before I could say anything, she already drove off. My little cousin was standing on our front deck, so I brought him inside. A couple hours passed by, and I noticed that a car wouldn't stop driving by my house, but I ignored it and continued to watch Adventure Time with my cousin. I was basically forced to babysit. It was about 10 o'clock at night. It was pretty dark outside, and I was about to put my cousin to sleep when I realized that there was loud banging at my front door. I peeked over a corner and saw a tall man standing outside. A sheer panic flew through my body. I rushed my cousin and I to the bathroom. The bathroom was like the size of half the living room, so I dig in my ammo can and pull out a small Bowie knife about the size of 2 ballpoint pens. So I grab that and my phone and run to the bathroom with my cousin. We lock ourselves in there and try to stay as quiet as possible. I look at my cousin, and he is on the verge of tears. He had both of his hands on his mouth. I could hear him muttering the words, "Where is my mommy?" I start to cry a little too, and a couple minutes pass by and I hear the door slam wide open. I then hear the man yell, "I'm gonna effing kill you." I start to full on cry, but I put my hands on my mouth. I call the police, which I should have done a while ago. Yeah. My happiness zooms through my body when I hear police sirens. The man starts trying to book it, but he accidentally steps on a nail. And get this, he was barefoot. The police arrive and arrest the man. They said he was a person who they have been looking for. My mom pulls in the driveway and sees what's happening. They told her he was a 46-year-old male who had been killing people around our little town. My mom brought me inside and asked what happened. I told her that my aunt dropped off my cousin and left. When my mom got a hold of my auntie, turns out she was doing slots and getting drunk. My mom had her arrested for having her child unattended and nearly killed. She was thrown in jail. The end, and all I have to say is, don't let your kids or leave your kids with another kid.